One of the things that I've seen in the last few years, specifically in South Africa, is how conservation practice itself has become militarized. So we see the entry of the army into environmental protection, particularly anti-poaching measures. We see the use of military technologies. We see military tactics. We see the retraining of the Ranger Force as a paramilitary unit. So really this sort of multi-layered, intensive militarization of conservation practice, I think it's particularly concerning given the way that private military corporations have moved into environmental protection. I think at one level, which may not seem obvious, but has to do with sort of the greenwashing that happens. Once a military firm moves into environmental protection, there's a way in which it can promote its environmentally friendly activities. And I think as an audience, we're left bedazzled at this sort of selfless contribution of military corporations. But in focusing on that, we're not focusing on the environmental destruction that's happening elsewhere as a result of their products.
My own work is looking at issues around body politics, like how does that actually impact the bodies in those places. For example, in Australia, in South Australia, there's a whole opening up of a military industry producing military ships. There's also training of the military. But how is that impacting the actual population in those places?
When we talk about population control, we're often talking about which lives do we want to prevent. But when we're talking about militarization, when you have militarized methods directed against perceived environmental transgressors, that often ends in their state-sanctioned death. And so I think this relationship between which lives we want to promote and which lives we want to extinguish and which lives we want to prevent brings these issues together, I think, in a really fundamental way.
The whole issue of surrogacy and surrogacy tourism.
Right.
In Australia, it's being banned in many states. You're not allowed to have surrogacy for payment. But you can go to, first of all, people are going to India, now they're going to Thailand. And particularly, it's gay people, gay men, gay women, or particularly gay men. There's a whole sort of spate of interest in those sorts of things. And that's, to me, where one of these dissonances between these technologies which are, if you like, producing possibilities for gay couples to have babies elsewhere, then the rights of the women who are the wombs for rent and the rights of the children that are being produced are in a very hazy and difficult area. So that's a very different thing than militarism, but it still, to me, is linked to that idea of people being able to be part of a sort of techno-science, what Haraway talks about, corporalization, where we're really rethinking bodies, rethinking possibilities of life. Population policy is not about, it's about choice, it's about human rights, it's not looking at the bigger issues. And the indigenous populations and their lives and histories have completely disappeared from that kind of discussion, which to me is very hard then to bring back, because it's then you're being romanticizing or denying the rights of people to consume as they should be able to consume, which is another side of that whole neo-Malthusianism.
We can say with, relatively good degree of certainty, if we want to be scientific about it, that I think one of the reasons that communities have in Southern Africa have engaged in poaching, it's both economically to make ends meet, but also there's a really severe sense of disenchantment with conservation and the way that people have been dispossessed year after year, decade after decade, from conservation areas in terms of physical displacement, in terms of not being able to gather natural resources, in terms of thinking that these animals are reserved for wealthy tourists, either domestically or internationally. And I think this sort of way in which communities in a colonial and post-colonial context have been violently taken apart, taken out of the picture, that leads to these really severe environmental consequences. And so I hope that, if anything good comes out of commercial poaching, it is this sort of reinvention of our understanding of the relationship between people and landscape, between people and environment, human, non-human relations. And Canada is actually way behind in a lot of its parks in terms of recognizing the histories of First Nations, their historical presence, but also their continuing presence within these landscapes, and how these landscapes do have meaning for them. And one of the sort of phenomena that I've been really interested in is the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta, which is part of the Cross-Border Blackfoot Confederacy. They've been engaging to try to get Parks Canada to basically reinvent Waterton Lakes National Park. It's an important Canadian park, to get signage changed to recognize that these were important cultural landscapes to them as well, and that they still are.
Well, Australia's famous Uluru, which is used to be called Ayers Rock, named after Henry Ayers, who was a colonial settler, very wealthy squatter, and then was given back in the 90s to the people who owned the land and called Uluru, which is it's symbolic of Australia's nationhood, but that has changed practices around that particular landscape.
But there's also a dangerous side to this as well, in terms of sort of right-wing environmentalism.
Exactly.
And I think the way that even in the United States and Canada, if you look at sort of the fear of the climate refugee, for example, I think some of that fear is based in understandings of sort of white colonial settler ideas of landscape, that this is our country, and we don't want our country, our landscape, to be polluted by that foreign other, especially if that foreign other is racialized as brown and as being sort of overly fertile in this way. So I think we also need to be very critical of this understanding of how landscape has certain emotional capacities, because it can also be used for very dangerous reasons to keep certain people out.
Well, even things like the hormones that are in all our food and what that's doing to our bodies, and how we are changing our fertilities. I mean, this is the other side of population, right? The unintended consequences of the type of industrial capitalism that we've had, and how do you deal with that? Again, that's just trying to get beyond it just being about a bad thing, like actually also saying maybe these are things we have to learn to love. Maybe this is the way our world was evolving. Maybe there's no pure body or pure nature, so how are we going to be combining it? Maybe the technologies are going to produce possibilities where you live with bodies that are different than what we perceive as the norm, right? In interesting ways. So I think that's for me, queer ecology is trying to combine cultural studies, art, a kind of reimagining of the body, but also reimagining of what is nature. As a feminist who grew up as an activist in the 80s, that's a big challenge, because I think I was in the era of thinking, it's all about peace and harmony and, living as one, I don't know, John Lennon kind of stuff. I'm also very interested in learning from how people who are able to go into very different areas of understanding.
One of the things that's, I think, really interesting in what you're talking about, and it's come up even in the talk so far, is the question of technology. I don't know if I'd commit myself to this completely, but just thinking off the cuff here about technology as this mediator between nature and society, not that they're ever separate, and to think about the politics of technology, and that technology, when we talk about what kind of futures we'd like, and to see that we have to take technology into account. And I think there's good reason to be skeptical when we talk about big pharma and its links to family planning and birth control around the world. But there's also something that's quite exciting about technology, that it does give us new possibilities and frees us up from that kind of naive dream of going back.
I think this corporatized idea that it is part of big industry, it is part of capitalism, but it's also where we are. So we need to work with it and resist, think about it, but not pretend that we can go beyond it. So I really like the idea of imagining futures which take that into account. I think that's very important.
I think when we talk about climate change and population, one of the most important things to recognize is the geographical irony of climate change. That parts of the world where most of greenhouse gases are being produced are parts of the world that are not being negatively impacted by climate change. And if you look at Canada, with the exception of the Arctic, southern Canada, where the majority of the population lives, there's a lot of projections that show, with at least in minor increases in temperature, that it'll be a great boon for Canada, that our agriculture will increase and this will be good because agriculture in other parts of the world will become more difficult and there'll be more demand for Canadian products. And so Canadians per capita are huge producers of greenhouse gases. When you recognize your connection to other parts of the world in light of do no harm, to me that's a motivator that even though we benefit from these processes, we have to address them. The big issue that we need to grapple with is the issue of the economy. Yeah. Because if we live in a capitalist society that is really dependent upon constant economic growth, that at the end of the day, this will lead us down problematic routes. If we know that consumption is the problem that's driving environmental change, that we have to answer really tough questions, I think, about the economy. Yeah.